Patrick and the Stripe team loves going after really hard problems? Or is there kind of a separate kind of reason?
It's a really good question, because when we think about climate, right, 90%-ish of our efforts are going to need to be focused on the emissions reduction piece. Carbon removal, we will not solve climate change with just carbon removal. The reason that we focused on it was essentially looking at where are some of the biggest problems in climate with the least relative attention, like least attention relative to their importance.
Right.
And carbon removal 4 years ago when we started was exactly that.
Okay, so welcome to Stripe Sessions, I guess. We're at Stripe Sessions today. Off Topic was kindly invited from the Stripe team to come visit, and it's been amazing. Today we're here with an amazing guest. We're here with Nan from Stripe. Can you give a quick introduction about yourself and then what you do?
I'm Nan Ransohoff. I lead Climate at Stripe, which is inclusive of both Stripe Climate, the product that we built for Stripe users, as well as Frontier. And this is all focused on how do we build a market for carbon removal.
What does the head of climate do, and why does Stripe need one?
So, I'll start with the second question first. Stripe is a infrastructure company. We are building infrastructure for the internet. And in some sense, you can look at what Stripe does as being in the business of economic growth. And one of the biggest inhibitors to economic growth is potentially climate change. So you take the really long view of Stripe's business, which we do, we view climate as really core to our mission in the really long run. So my job as head of climate at Stripe is really focusing on what are the levers that we can pull, that we're sort of uniquely positioned to pull in the climate space to help minimize the likelihood that that climate is sort of an economic impediment going forward.
Got it. And then can you talk a little bit about kind of the different products that you have underneath kind of the Stripe Climate and then Frontier, correct?
So they're all actually quite connected. I'll tell you a little bit about how this all kind of came to be and the sort of the string between the three of them. We are focused on building a market for carbon removal, and there are a couple different ways that we do that that are linked together, and we'll talk about that. But the first is we've built Stripe Climate, which is a product for Stripe users that makes it easy for any Stripe users to direct a fraction of their revenue to carbon removal, which we then pool together and use it to buy carbon removal down the cost curve. And then we also have Frontier, which is a sort of almost an extension of that. And so we've pooled our funds, both Stripe corporate, Stripe Climate users funds, as well as Alphabet, McKinsey, Shopify, Meta, JP Morgan, and a number of other folks to raise now over $1 billion to buy even more carbon removal down the cost curve. So our team is really focused on this carbon removal piece, not just for Stripe, but on sort of on behalf of the ecosystem more broadly. So Stripe Climate and Frontier originated back in 2019 with a small corporate commitment. This was $1 million initially from Stripe to buy permanent carbon removal. And we can talk all about carbon removal and sort of what the problem is there, but the high level is in climate, we need to get global emissions from about 50 gigatons today down to net zero by 2050. There are two levers that we can pull, primary levers that we can pull. The first is stopping emitting in the first place. And the second is sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And we're gonna have to do a huge amount of both, but we are particularly far behind on the second. And part of the reason we're so behind on the second is carbon removal, unlike energy, for example, has no intrinsic value. The end user doesn't get value from it. And as a result, there have been no buyers. And because there have been no buyers, there have been no companies. Because why would you start a company if there is no prospect of a customer?
Right.
Or why would you invest in a company if there's no prospect of that company having revenue? So there's been this chicken and egg problem in carbon removal, and the idea with Stripe's initial $1 million was we are going to spend that buying carbon removal. We are not investing in it, we're not making an equity investment, we're really buying it, and we're buying it at any available price, even if the technology is really early and expensive today. When we did that, we essentially got a sort of strangely positive reaction from the carbon removal community, which to us just said that this field has been so starved for customers that anybody really cared about $1 million.
Right.
So that led us, we also heard from Stripe users saying, hey, we've wanted to do something in climate for a while, but we haven't because it's hard to figure out what to do. Could we send you some money and you figure out what to do with it? So that's what led us to phase 2, which is Stripe Climate. And we built a product that makes it really easy for any Stripe business to direct a fraction of their revenue to carbon removal. We pull that together and then use that to buy even more carbon removal down the cost curve. That kind of got us from $1 million to tens of millions of dollars. And then about 2.5 years ago, we got in a room and we said, okay, well, this field is on the one hand making a lot of progress. On the other hand, it's still really far behind. What can we do to ratchet the market for carbon removal up? And we came up with a bunch of ideas. We killed a bunch of ideas. And one of the ideas that we couldn't kill was this concept of an advanced market commitment. We can talk more about what that is, but that is where Frontier came from. It is an advanced market commitment to buy now over $1 billion of carbon removal from these companies. And so the theme across all of these is how do we make that demand side market for carbon removal while policy catches up?
Got it. So Stripe essentially is almost forcibly creating demand, and then that's helping kind of accelerate kind of innovation and kind of new players in the space and creating a market. So then, at a certain point, there'll be enough supply and demand where maybe Stripe doesn't have to forcibly put in a ton of dollars, but maybe that's where Frontier comes in, right? Where you have a lot of different players, your partners coming in, putting money into the market, and with Frontier, if I remember correctly, you don't take a fee out of it. You're just helping facilitate kind of the buying and selling, correct?
Exactly. You can think about the way that you put it at the beginning is really perfect. It's a pull. It's called a demand pull mechanism, and you create demand incentives to compel suppliers to start innovating and to start scaling up their technology. You compel investors to start investing in this because there's a prospect of a market. And you're also exactly right to say that in the long run, because of how big the carbon removal space needs to be, this will eventually be funded, hopefully, by policymakers.
Right.
And so you can think about what we're doing as, how do we help get carbon removal on its best possible trajectory and get this industry to first base, but policy is going to have to take it the rest of the way there.
Makes sense. And then, in terms of, why, you're going after carbon removal versus reducing carbon emissions, was it just because there's less demand on that side? And it's a harder problem, and I know, Patrick and the Stripe team loves going after really hard problems. Or is there kind of a separate kind of reason why?
It's a really good question, because when we think about climate, right, 90%-ish of our efforts are going to need to be focused on the emissions reduction piece. Carbon removal, we will not solve climate change with just carbon removal. The reason that we focused on it was essentially looking at where are some of the biggest problems in climate with the least relative attention, least attention relative to their importance.
Right.
And carbon removal 4 years ago when we started was exactly that. The fact that anybody cared about $1 million is a good signal that carbon removal is sort of underfunded relative to its importance. And so it's not for not caring deeply about all those other pieces, but instead saying, where do we think that, where's a really big problem, and where do we think we're sort of uniquely positioned to maybe kickstart the market or kickstart the solutions?
Makes sense. And then now, you're shifting, as you kind of mentioned, to phase 2 of this. Have you seen kind of the companies that you work with also kind of shift and kind of, definitely accounting practices have kind of evolved with carbon, with carbon counting? What kind of processes or kind of evolution have you seen from your partners kind of evolving from the their phase 1 to phase 2?
On the buyer side, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So most companies and countries have a version of a net zero commitment, and there are 3 main components of a net zero commitment. The first is measure your emissions. The second is reduce them as much as possible. And the third is deal with the rest. And the deal with the rest piece for most companies and countries is very squishy right now. And until quite recently, there were only a couple of buyers in the carbon removal space. And now we're starting to see many more. There's still a huge shortage, to be clear,
right.
Both from companies and from countries. But I think increasingly everybody is realizing that in order for the solutions to be available to solve that third part of the equation, we have to start buying them now so that they can get down the volume curve and up, down the cost curve and up the volume curve.
Makes sense. And in terms of the carbon credits that you're actually buying, the companies that you're buying from, like I think when most people think of like carbon removal, they think of like planting trees.
Yeah.
Like that's like I think the very basic kind of.
Totally.
But there's obviously a limit to planting trees, and then you also have some innovations in creating kind of like super trees. There's startups doing that. What are some other kind of like carbon removal, tactics or like strategies that that startups are taking?
So you called out a couple of important ones, and things like planting trees and soil carbon sequestration are going to be part of the solution set. The problem is there's only so many acres that we can, like acres of arable land that we can plant trees in, and so there is this need for other solutions that do not take up as much arable land and that are ideally permanent, because when you emit a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, it stays there permanently, so we have to take it out permanently as well. So we're looking for solutions at Frontier that are, more than thousands of years of permanence. They have a path to being low cost and high volume in the future, even if they aren't there today, and are not constrained by arable land. That's kind of the crux of what we look for. In terms of examples, what is cool about the carbon removal space is we're starting to see a huge diversity in the kinds of companies that people are creating and the kinds of approaches that folks are trying. For example, rocks, actually, most of the Earth's carbon is in the lithosphere, in rocks. And so there's this growing subfield of carbon removal called enhanced weathering, which essentially uses rocks as sponges to suck CO2 out of the air and is essentially trying to take what nature does already and speed it up.
Right.
There's another example of a company that is taking waste biomass, so like corn stover. So plants already do this, right, through photosynthesis, and they'll suck CO2 out of the air, store it in their biomass, and then you grow some corn, there's leftover biomass. They're taking this and pyrolyzing it. They heat it up without oxygen, turn it into bio oil, and then inject that underground. So how do you take the free carbon capture that nature already does and make that permanent? Another example, just to give you a flavor, is direct air capture. This is the most photogenic of the bunch. You see these like giant fans sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that's like a whole other subthread. But there are sort of a growing number of companies, and we think that there should be many more.
Have you seen any like direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering, biomass storage?
Yes.
I think those are
Yes.
kind of the things you mentioned. Have you seen any other kind of like very like novel things that maybe haven't like shown the full promise yet, but like maybe like this might be something interesting? There's
an increasing. I think that there's a focus on oceans that has a lot of potential, and on rivers. And so we're starting to look at kind of like what is the enhanced weathering equivalent for rivers, for example.
Right.
I think another area where we think there may be a ton of promise and is underexplored is with big industrials. Like in a sense, if you want this to get really cheap in the future, which we do, we're curious about if there are ways that we can piggyback on existing industrial processes to make slight tweaks. So for example, when you mine for copper or mine for nickel, you end up with these big piles of rocks called mine tailings, and those are potentially sponges, right, for CO2. And so how can you take those legacy tailings and turn them into carbon removal sinks?
Right.
How do you take leftover quicklime from cement and use that to suck up a bunch of carbon? I think that there's like a sneaky amount of innovation in the industrial space that we are currently overlooking.
Interesting. And then so your team looks and identifies these companies. You're constantly looking for them. Where do you usually find these types of companies, and then what's kind of the process of actually figuring out which companies to actually fund and which companies to partner with?
So, I mean, there is innovation is everywhere, right? And so I think it's hard to predict exactly where that's going to come from. And one of the things that's cool about an AMC is you can send a sort of general call for startups and opportunities to actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere. But the general process that we take is we're looking at 4 different lenses. The first is, does this project meet our target criteria, which we talked about? The second is, from an execution standpoint, can this company do the thing that they say that they want to do? 3, does this help us build a risk-adjusted portfolio of approaches so that collectively those will get to climate relevant scale? And then 4, is there a unique way that we can be accelerative in this? And so in practice, what that means is we go visit these companies. We talk to a lot of experts. We have 6 PhDs on staff that are looking at these companies, and we go quite deep. There's an early track for really early stage companies, which we can talk more about. And then there's another track called our offtake track for later stage companies. And we try to match the track to where the companies are based on their sort of current trajectory.
Got it. And then what is the relationship with these companies? Does it feel more like an investor, like investee relationship? Does it feel more like a client kind of, what's kind of the relationship? Do you constantly keep in touch with them?
We do. I mean, our objective is for these companies to succeed, and we are trying to do the best that we can to remove roadblocks for them. And the main roadblock that we remove is by being their customer, but we spend a lot of time also with them on policy initiatives and on measurement and verification challenges and on hiring. If they are looking for a critical hire, we'll help them with that. So we really try to sort of be in their corner as much as possible because this is hard enough, and having somebody else sort of go to bat for them is at least what we intend to do.
Does that kind of limit, because you do partner relatively closely with your companies, does that limit kind of the number of companies you can back? Is that kind of an issue kind of internally?
It's a really good question. We have not used that capacity as a constraint for us.
Right.
What we try to do is find the first thing is how can we find general problems and then solve problems that will benefit multiple companies.
Right.
Policy is a really good example. We helped start this organization last year in the US called the Carbon Removal Alliance that is run by the companies that are sort of locking arms and going to sort of pursuing various policy initiatives in the US. But that was a common pain point that we heard from many, and then turn that into this sort of self-sustaining thing that we don't run, but that can help them. I think probably there's a version of the answer to that question of maybe in the future we want to staff up a bit more for better portfolio support. But I think for now, it feels like it's at least temporarily in an okay spot.
Got it. And how big is the team currently?
There are 16 of us.
Got it. And then is it kind of divided into kind of different teams within? Is there more of a team that focuses on kind of finding and sourcing?
So everybody that we hire typically works on multiple areas. So it's a pretty dynamic group of people. I generally think about folks in sort of 3 buckets. We have the sort of stitchers or quarterbacks, and these folks are usually owning an outcome. So if we're doing a deal with Lithos or Charm or Heirloom or CCI, they're the ones that are sort of owning that deal. Should we do this deal? What should the structure be? What's the contract? How do we make sure that we've sort of done all of the diligence that we want to? These are kind of our quarterback stitchers.
Right.
There's a bunch of PhDs in here, as well as more commercially minded folks.
They'd be like the VCs and
Kind of, yeah, exactly. And then the second bucket is our area experts. And so these are folks who are really deep in science, really deep in policy, finance, legal, comms. And you can think about the stitchers as sort of horizontal, and then these folks are going really deep in areas and get pulled into many, many deals. And then the third area is our product team. So we have a small team of design, product, and engineering to sort of help operationalize all of this.
Right.
And the team, as well as the website, and sort of building other tools for us and for the field and for companies.
Awesome. And then can you talk a little bit about kind of some of the companies that you've backed? What they do, what you kind of see kind of promising in them.
So
I know there's quite a list. Maybe not all the companies.
All 32.
So it's 32 backed over how many years?
So we have like a bunch that we backed through Stripe Climate.
Got it.
And there's more, I don't actually know what the total number is, probably in the mid 40s would be my guess.
Okay.
For Frontier specifically, there's 32 companies. 4 of these so far have been through our offtake track.
Okay.
And the rest through our pre-purchase track. And 2 of those companies in the offtake track started in our pre-purchase track and then graduated to the offtake track in a pretty short period of time, actually, which is, I think, really promising. But for example, so one company, Lithos, we facilitated a $53 million offtake with them in December. They are an enhanced weathering company, and they take ground up basalt that is already finely ground from existing rock quarries. They transport that to farms, and farmers will spread that on their fields in lieu of ag liming. So it is a way to both improve crop yields as well as capture and permanently remove carbon. So this is not to be confused with soil, like organic soil carbon. It is permanently removed because the carbon mineralizes. So that's in our view, a really neat example of a company that is like pretty low tech. The hardest part about what they're doing is the measurement, because it's an open system. How do you know how much carbon you actually removed, and how can you be confident in that? So Lithos' innovation was both in stitching together waste basalt from quarries with farms, as well as the measurement and reporting innovation that they came up with. So that's like an example of one company that we're excited about. Charm Industrial is another one. They're the corn stover company, or they do many other sources of biomass besides corn stover, but essentially they're leveraging what nature already does well, taking that waste biomass, whether it's from agriculture or old forest residues, anything that is waste, making that permanent and then injecting that back underground as bio-oil. That's another company that we're excited about. There's like truly dozens that I could talk about, but those are some of our offtake ones. And both of those companies went from, we were their first customer as a pre-purchaser, and also their first off-taker in less than 3 years.
Do you continue to be their customer, or is it like one-time purchases like every 6 months, or is like what's kind of the?
It's an open. So the way that these contracts are set up is from an offtake. So a pre-purchase is $500,000 typically that we give to a company upfront before they've delivered removal. So this is intended for companies and ideas that are just getting started. They're just getting out of the lab, or maybe they're still in the lab. That's okay too. Offtakes are contracts that are a legally binding agreement to purchase a certain number of tons of carbon removal at a certain price if the company can deliver.
So
most of these are multi-year contracts where we are saying we'll buy this many tons in this year, this many tons in this year, et cetera. And so in that sense, it's like we're continuing to be their customer. If they deliver all of that and they're still sort of can digest more in the short term, we would consider that. We have not gotten to that point yet. I would love for us to get to that point, but it just hasn't happened yet.
But that's a few years down the line that we'll hopefully see companies kind of re-up with you, and you'll continue to support them.
That's right.
Awesome. I think in the Lithos example, you mentioned, I think, a problem that I think is pretty prevalent within kind of the climate change kind of movement is the issue of being able to trace and kind of actually monitor and actually figure out how much carbon you're actually removing or offsetting. I think a lot of the industries have had some issues around that space. What solutions have you kind of seen around that, or like what kind of initiatives do you think we need more like standards around it? Like what's kind of like the path to go with this?
It's a great question, and folks in the field typically refer to this as MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. Because carbon removal is so heterogeneous and because it's so new, the types of methodologies to measure these solutions are different depending on pathways. For example, direct air capture. It is a stream of CO2 that you are getting out of this sort of, out of a compressor. it is very easy to measure.
Right.
It is much harder to measure if you are putting, magnesium in the ocean or if you are putting basalt on fields. Right. And so one of the sort of ways that we can think about open systems, we call those open systems. The world is complicated, and there are many benefits of an open system. They tend to be cheaper, for example, but harder to measure. How can we think about what are the bounds of uncertainty? Like, what are the areas that we can be sure and what are the areas where we're not sure? And can we discount the tons delivered appropriately so that the tons that we are counting, we are highly confident in?
Right.
So that's like an example of sort of one of the ways that we deal with this. But for each individual pathway, there are protocols that need to be developed. There are sort of overarching standards that also need to be developed. And a lot of this work is sort of underway, but it's very much an area where like we're building the plane as we're flying it.
Right.
And part of what you need in order to design a good protocol is a technology to test it with.
Sure.
And so many of these companies are just getting to the point where they're like removing tons, they're delivering tons.
Right.
So I think in the next 2 to 4 years, there's going to be a big sort of stepwise improvement in our knowledge around how to effectively measure and report on these technologies.
Got it. And is the measurement, is that more of like a burden on the company side, on the startup side to do it, or is that something where Stripe comes in and helps as well?
So all of our prices pay for when we sign an offtake agreement with these companies, we are not only paying for the removal but also for the MRV.
Right.
So we are paying for that, and we recognize that in some of these pathways, the MRV is expensive because it's like cheaper for DAC, it's more expensive for enhanced weathering.
Right.
But like you have to account for both of those things in the price because you want a verified ton. We spend a lot of time with companies helping on the protocol development, but ultimately. And we will approve the protocol that we ultimately verify against. So I would say we help in the ecosystem sense, but fortunately, there's a lot of other really exciting players coming into the space to fill a lot of those gaps, and the whole community is really trying to work together to like push the thing forward.
Yeah. And I think, as you mentioned, there's so many new technologies coming in that like there's going to be so many different pathways that like it's hard to create a standard current like at this moment.
Right.
So just we're going to have to measure it in different ways, and hopefully in the future we can start creating better kind of like overall standards and measurements around it. That makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the demand pool that that you guys are creating. I think you had mentioned on our podcast about this concept of advanced market commitments, and can you talk a little bit about what that is and what where was the inspiration coming from?
So we borrowed this idea from vaccines. In the mid 2000s. We, in the proverbial sense, wanted a pneumococcal vaccine for low-income countries. And the pharma companies were not motivated to invent and scale that because they were worried about, will the end customer be able to pay enough? If these are low-income countries, is the ability to pay high enough to help them recoup their costs? And so what happened in the mid-2000s, this was an idea from some economists, was to essentially pool money from governments and philanthropies to say, hey, Glaxo, Pfizer, et cetera, if you can develop a vaccine that meets these specs and scale it, there's a market for it. You will have customers. And it worked. It compelled them to develop the vaccine and scale the vaccine likely around many years earlier than they otherwise would have. And so we took that same concept and applied it to carbon removal. So far, that idea has been applied to, as far as we know, like vaccines. It was applied both in the pneumococcal vaccine case as well as Operation Warp Speed to some extent in the U.S. For the COVID-19 vaccine. But while the market dynamics are not identical, they're very similar. And this idea of how do you create economic and find commercial incentive for the innovators to produce the thing that is going to benefit the world.
Right. What are some like the risks associated on with that? And then have you or the Stripe team have made kind of any adjustments specific to climate and carbon removal?
Good question. So I'll to answer the second question first. There were a number of big edits that we had to make from like an AMC for carbon removal versus an AMC for a vaccine.
Right.
One of those examples is who are your buyers? In the case of the pneumococcal vaccine, the buyers were philanthropists and governments, and in our case, it's sort of big companies.
Right.
Another example is who are the suppliers. In the case of the pneumococcal vaccine, these were big pharma companies that had balance sheets. They did not need extra financing to build these facilities. They had that. In the case of carbon removal, the suppliers are startups. They don't have big balance sheets. They can't finance these facilities on their own. And so one of the big edits that we made was this AMC is offtake agreements. And so what these offtake agreements are essentially a thing that enables suppliers to go to a bank and say, hey, if I build this facility, there's going to be somebody to pay for it. Can I have some financing to help me with that? So that was sort of a structural edit that we made. And then I think the final one I'll call out is in the case of the pneumococcal AMC, $1.5 billion was enough by itself to get get this end product to exist. It was enough to get the vaccine for low-income countries to exist. In the case of carbon removal, we are kind of getting this field like a couple steps down the cost curve, but we are not getting it all the way to sub $100 a ton. And as a result, in a sense, our AMC is maybe a little riskier than a traditional AMC, but raising $100 billion wasn't an option. So we picked $1 billion because it was maybe from governments for sure. Yeah.
That's interesting. I think, and do you think there's also a difference of, a vaccine is probably much more known and it's understandable, and I think the outcomes are a lot more clear versus climate. It's a little bit it's a lot newer, right? And so the process is slightly less understood. So there is a little bit more risk factor there as well.
There is, and the words that the language that economists would use to describe that is how technologically distant is the thing that you're trying to create. And you're right that for vaccines, that distance was much shorter than for carbon removal. For carbon removal, it's like, is it rocks? Is it direct air capture? Is it ocean alkalinity enhancement? There's so much more diversity. And actually, that's one of the things that makes an AMC a good fit, because you can send a technology neutral call to say, as long as it's permanent and as the path to being low cost and high volume, we don't care what it looks like. You're the innovators. You tell us what you think the best thing is. And so there's sort of different versions of an AMC in terms of technological distance, but that tech neutral ability of AMCs, I think, is really one of its strengths.
Do you think the end kind of answer of the goal that you guys are trying to go after, do you think it'll be a kind of one or two solutions that end up kind of really winning out and really making the biggest impact, or do you think it'll be 5 to 10 or a lot of it'll be a very diverse kind of solution set?
I think it's impossible to actually say.
Sure.
But because of how huge the numbers are here, the IPCC's median case is around 6 billion tons per year of removal by 2050. The United States emits about that much every single year. It's just a really, really big number. I think that because of that, it is most likely that is going to be a portfolio approach. For example, there's how much waste basalt is there? How much waste biomass is there? All of these technologies have strengths and weaknesses, and not dissimilar actually to renewable energy. It's probably not just going to be solar or just nuclear. Different geographies have different needs and sort of requirements. So my best guess is that this is going to be a diverse portfolio. There will be some solutions that don't work that we will discover, but I think it is still going to be a portfolio.
And I'm assuming cost is probably going to be the number one issue for a long time, of being able to lower kind of the cost of because for example direct air capture right now is very expensive. Yeah. But how have you seen kind of the cost kind of come down in some of the technologies that you guys have worked with?
They're starting to come down in some cases, but this field is basically 6 years old, and it's hard tech.
Right.
So most people realized in 2018 that this was an issue after reading the IPCC report. And then you have to realize that it's an issue, and then you have to quit your job and figure out what you're working on and find your co-founder and build. So, and then build your first plant. So we're still really at the beginning.
Right.
But for example, Charm Industrial is one of the companies that we facilitated an offtake with. And over the course of the offtake, the base case is for the price to go down 37%, but has the ability to go down by more than 65%, even over by 2030. Wow. So we will see, and I think part of the trick here is going from what looks true in a spreadsheet is not always what's true in the real world, and so we have to sort of make that transition and learn as we go. And some things will pleasantly surprise us, and some things will be harder in practice.
But I think this is where I think I think in a previous episode in the podcast that I run, I talked a little bit about sustainability and how, I think a lot of people currently, and it's not exactly a bad thing, talk about sustainability in the sense that we have to limit ourselves and we have to not stop doing things. But I think what technology allows us to do is this keep the same amount of whether it's consumption or something else, but do it in a much better way. And I think carbon removal is a great way of that, and kind of thinking about things from first principles. And so what is that kind of the vision that you're saying as well, in terms of how we should approach sustainability, because it often is viewed kind of negatively, but I kind of want to see it in a more optimist light.
I think you've said it really well. And I think you're also capturing what is a hopefully growing trend of viewing sort of sustainability as this sort of, in slightly maybe more of a negative or anti-consumption light, to this sort of revised view, which is how do we decouple economic growth and emissions?
Right.
How do we continue to provide, how can we continue to use more energy, but just do it in a way that does not harm the environment?
Right.
And I think that what we are seeing is that it's incredibly possible. We are seeing many countries do this. There's a great chart published recently by Our World in Data of all the countries that have been able to sort of demonstrate that decoupling. And we have a number of people that live in the developing world that ideally would be using more energy per capita. And how do we help everybody improve their sort of quality of life without negatively harming the atmosphere and the environment? I think that is very possible and very tractable. And this is really the generation I think that has the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited to be part of this kind of generation, kind of growing up and seeing kind of the newest kind of technologies come in and start changing the world.
Yeah.
In terms of some kind of quick fire stuff, for people who are kind of watching this or listening to this podcast, I think a lot of people, they know some stuff about climate change and kind of climate tech, but not deep. They're not scientists. They haven't done deep dives on it. What are places where people can look and kind of see kind of the newest kind of either trends or kind of tech or different? Where do you kind of look?
Well, climate is basically the entire global economy, right?
It's a very wide.
It's really everything. So I wrote, I'll make a short plug for, I get a version of this question a lot, and I wrote a piece that is two pieces. One that is trying to sort of paint a overall mental model for folks who are new to the space and trying to figure out where to go. One of the challenges with climate is because it's such a broad surface area, ideally you'd pick one or two to go deep into, otherwise you have to learn everything about everything. So that is one, there's that's one piece, and there's also another one on how to think about finding a job in climate and different approaches to that. A couple other resources that I really like. Watershed has a good reading list on their website. Ezra Klein's done a bunch of podcasts on climate that I think are really good, as has Heat Map. They just started a new podcast that I think is really excellent. And then Our World in Data has done a lot of deep diving on climate, and I think really, really highly of them as well.
Yeah, I personally like Hannah Ritchie's
She's fabulous.
newsletter. She's amazing, and she provides it in
she
such
just
a
wrote
nice
a book.
way. Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So check that out.
We'll plug that too.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then in terms of how long have you been in this field for, and what was kind of your path to get there?
I've been in carbon removal for 4 years.
Okay.
And my path into that was reading the 2018 IPCC report. And I was sort of trying, so maybe to back up, I was doing climate stuff on the emissions reduction side back in 2012 at O-Power, which is one of the first gen climate companies back in the first boom, as well as Nest, the thermostat company. I was at Uber Pool trying to get more people in fewer cars. So I've been in the climate space broadly defined, right, for a little while. And my path into carbon removal was really from this 2018 IPCC report. I was trying to re-educate myself on some of the basic math. And one of the things that jumps out of that report is, in addition to a huge amount of emissions reduction, we're also going to have to do a lot of removal. And as I started learning more, I was like, who's working on this? And there were a couple of suppliers at the time, but I am not a scientist by training. I'm not an engineer by training. That didn't seem like the area that I could have the most impact in. So then I sort of zoomed back out of the supply side and over the demand side and really started thinking about, how do you build a market for carbon removal in the absence of policy? And that was around the same time that Stripe had just published this blog post for $1 million to buy permanent carbon removal. I chatted with Stripe because I was like, that's a great theory of change. That makes a lot of sense to me. And then one thing led to another, and here we are.
And then, so you said for 4 years, right?
Yeah.
In the carbon removal space, what coming into this this market, what have you kind of learned that or what have you changed your mind about coming in that you didn't expect to, or what was kind of the learnings that you've had?
These all may sound obvious, but I think one of the big learnings is that maybe there's two that I'll call out. The first is that when you have a really new ecosystem that basically doesn't exist, like carbon removal as a field didn't exist, even if you only want to play one role, like we are technically at Frontier and Stripe Climate the buyer. Because the field is so young, you have to pay attention to all of these other parts of the ecosystem. Otherwise, you'll get bottlenecked. How do you think about MRV? How do you think about first of a kind financing? How do you think about making sure there are enough companies working on the right things? It's been much more of an ecosystem role than just the buying role, which is I think probably generalizable to many other sort of important global problems that are anemic and haven't gotten the attention that they've needed to date. I think the second thing is, especially in climate, all roads kind of lead back to policy. And I think that sometimes, maybe historically, there's been a bit of a aversion to think about policy from the private sector, and I think that's a miss. I think that it's actually really interesting and really important and much more tractable and less black boxy than at least I initially thought. I was like, I'm not a policymaker, I know nothing about this space, and I am not a policymaker, and I still only know a little bit about this space, but I think it's really important, and it's something that especially in big areas like climate, it has to be part of, if not, much of the conversation quite early.
That makes sense. Because it's not just businesses that have to worry about this; it's governments at this point. So that makes a lot of sense. Where can entrepreneurs or startups that are in this category find you, or find Stripe Climate or Frontier, I guess?
So we have a frontierclimate.com/apply. There are lots of resources for early stage companies, and please reach out to us if you're working on carbon removal. We have, for that first track, for the early stage track, we do a round of purchasing every year. We are about to announce this next round. So if you're working on carbon removal, we would love to talk to you and be your first customer, essentially. So that's probably the best place to get in touch.
And it doesn't matter where in the world you are.
No, and in fact, we really want to see more companies in other parts of the world. I think this is a global challenge, and innovation comes from everywhere. So we're about more than 50% of our companies now are not in the U.S.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So we're very excited in upping that number as well.
Awesome. Well, Nan, thank you for your time today. It was great chatting.
Thanks so much. These were fabulous questions.
Awesome.